Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking another one of my rules and I am going to post a review of some free sparring. But this is going to be a little bit more interesting than normal because Arto Fama came to Columbus, Ohio this last weekend and fought some of the people who go there. And one of those people was Trevor Pederson, someone who is currently very high ranked in HEMA ratings, though only with a few tournaments. And as someone who knows him personally, someone who's probably not going to post very more tournaments in the future. The reason for this is because they are now retired A-rated Olympic fencer, and they just aren't very interested in it. But what is still important to understand is that they are a very good fencer, and this is a very interesting interaction where we can see a couple of things going on here that I would categorize into a bit of layers. The first is we can see and understand how each of these two fencers fence, and it's a very interesting interaction and a very interesting fight, even though it's free sparring, to break down. But on top of that, there's also the kind of meta layer of the fact that Arto was here giving a demonstration and a seminar. And the idea here is that when you're giving a seminar, part of the point is to help other people improve their fencing. And I thought there was a very interesting conversation here in how each person can try to improve their conversation, even though it's Arto's seminar. So as I'm going through all of these exchanges, I'm going to break down what happened as per usual, but I'm also going to talk about the stylistic differences between these two types of fencers and the two types of fencing, and more importantly, how one could maybe teach and apply those principles even if you aren't those two people. The idea being is that if you attended this seminar, you might have seen this fight, and what would you do if you were there to try to learn from it even though you weren't the one participating? So for our first exchange, we have one that I think encapsulates about 65% of what Arto's fencing style really is all about. The first step being his footwork. You'll notice that throughout this entire fight or free sparring that Arto pretty much only ever takes passing steps. And he does so in order to do two things primarily. One, passing steps are longer than simple steps. Simple step being the one where you just shuffle your feet forward and you keep the same foot forward as happens. Most people, as you'll probably recognize, fight with their right foot forward in HEMA nowadays, as it allows them to use simple steps and keep their most athletic leg forward. And that's what you see Trevor here doing on the right in the red jacket. So Arto, again, who's on the left, is going to constantly make passing steps, but he's going to do a couple of very key things. One, he's going to try to make sure that he doesn't take a passing step into range, but tries to take a passing step as his opponent moves either forward or backward. And the reason for this is somewhat obvious. If you take a passing step while your opponent takes a simple step backwards, chances are you're going to catch up to them. And if you take a passing step forward as your opponent has just finished a step forward, chances are their simple step backwards isn't going to be able to get them away. So it's a really effective chasing tool. But of course, the caveat is that taking a full step every single time means that sometimes you can end up overcommitted. And there is a secondary part to this tactic that I haven't talked about yet, and that is offline stepping. If every time you take a passing step forward, you go directly at your opponent, well, you're probably going to end up overextended a lot because you'll end up overrunning them and ending up really close. And ending up in that close range can sometimes be problematic for performing certain techniques. So what Arto likes to do is he likes to take it at maybe like a 30, 45 degree angle sometimes. And the idea here is that by changing the angle, you're essentially changing the distance that you are advancing with your passing step. So despite the fact that you're still going to take a full step every single time, you can still dictate how much range and how much distance you actually cover towards your opponent by just changing the angle of your movement. Now, the other aspect of this is that every time you take a step offline, you pretty much have to take the other step to the opposite offline direction in order to continue to move forward. Otherwise, you end up walking off to some side towards the door. So it is somewhat predictable, and we're going to get into that predictability a little bit later. But another aspect that really makes this important is that Arto loves Zwerkhaus. He's very good at them, and he's very strong there, and he's very good at throwing ones that defend and attack simultaneously, just as the books tell you. And this footwork is very integral to that application. Because he's constantly moving forward, he's getting into situations where he is closing distance because, again, he's taking bigger steps. And because he's moving offline, he can close off a whole lot of lines and open up a whole lot of others by knowing exactly which Zwerkau he's going to throw based on which foot he moves forward. If he takes a step forward with his right foot and then throws a left Zwerkau, what he can essentially do is he can move the left side of his body off center towards your left and then ensure that his left Zwerk is now further off to the side so that anything that's coming in on that line is going to have a harder time getting through. It's a very basic application of line work and distance management, but it's not something that you see a lot. So if you were looking to try to apply this yourself, this is a perfect demonstration of what he would probably be talking about in his seminars. Now, for our second exchange, we have one that, again, is very indicative of Trevor's style this time. Now, the difference in how these two fight, again, is a little bit more obvious than just the footwork, but the footwork is a pretty good place to start. As I mentioned, Trevor likes to fight with his right leg forward, his dominant leg, and the one that he's most used to in Olympic fencing. And despite the fact that you would think that only being able to take simple steps and lunges would really limit your ability to move, that's not really the case here, as you can see in what happens. Now, one of the aspects of taking passing steps that I didn't mention is that there is a phase in every passing step, what I like to call, or at least Cheney likes to call, the travel phase. And the reason it's an important thing to consider is that when we're breaking down the concept of fencing, we also often like to break things down into stages, because every single one of those stages is an opportunity to either attack, parry, or get hit. And in this case, the travel phase is an important one to consider because it's one where it's really, really difficult to parry or attack, but it's really easy to get hit. And that's what happens here in this particular exchange. Arto takes a step forward, throws a big Crumphau to his left side in order to try to set aside what he thinks is coming from Trevor, only to find that it is not there. And as Trevor comes back and reasserts his point, Arto throws another big right Crumphau that windshield wipes all the way to the other side of his body. And this is the point where he has finished his step and he is very open and he's starting to take another step. While this happens, Trevor throws a right Zverkow to the body, which lands, and then he is able to get out of range with a little bit of a turn of his body and a void. And the reason this works is because Arto was hit during his travel step. You can see that basically at the end of this exchange, he's standing there with his sword up here at the end of his right Crumphau, and he really doesn't have anything to do other than maybe try to throw an afterblow that would most certainly be late. So if there's something you want to learn from this particular exchange, it's that if you're fencing someone who loves to use passing steps, remember that they have one very critical vulnerability point, and that is when one foot is moving through the air, but it hasn't started moving and it hasn't landed yet. Again, this is the travel phase, and it's super vulnerable because there's only one leg on the floor, and they have completely given up their ability to change direction. Whatever piece of footwork they've committed to, they're going to have to finish, whether they like it or not. For our next exchange, we have another thing that Trevor does that is extremely unusual. But if you break it down into its subsequent parts, it's actually not that strange. And what it is the parry that he throws after he lands his hit. As you can see by this exchange, Trevor just kind of beats the blade, lands a little hand snipe. But what he does after is what's important. And what he does is he does what most people consider a Molinet, meaning that he lands his hit and then he makes a circle with his sword off to his left side, which manages to parry an afterblow from Arto. Now, it's called a Molinet in a lot of saber and I think a couple of rapier sources, and that's because it's just a French word and I don't even really know what it means and I don't care. But what makes this special is that a lot of people would say, well, there are no Molinets in German longsword or even Italian longsword, and I would somewhat disagree, because in a lot of ways, the Molinet is actually just an extremely fast application of the hanging parry. Now, if you watch this in slow motion, which you've probably done a couple times now, you see that hit land, and what you see is Trevor move through a position that most people would call a left hanger, namely that his sword was dangling down on his left side, and he used that as a temporary position to then return back to a normal stance. The idea here is that every hanging parry can be a Molinet as long as it's an active movement rather than a passive one, meaning that if Trevor had simply stood in that hanging position, he still probably would have parried the afterblow, but it would have been much slower in throwing an afterblow after that. Now, of course, in this particular exchange, he didn't need to do that, but this is a really important thing to learn and consider, because if you're looking at trying to speed up your own parry riposts, this is the kind of thing you should be thinking about integrating. Using blocking positions like a hanging parry as a movement position, as a stance that you move through rather than go to. And the idea is that the less time you spend in static positions, the less time you're wasting not hitting and not parrying, as long as you can, of course, time the attack appropriately. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about are Arto's Crumphau's. And I've mentioned them a few times before now already, and you've seen them a few times before. And one thing that is worth talking about is both the pros and cons of this Crumphau. Now, in this particular exchange, you pretty easily see one of the cons, and that is a Crumphau in order to block requires a whole lot of movement. but it only keeps certain areas really safe. Now, in this particular exchange, Trevor throws something of a middle how straight to the left shoulder of Arto. Arto throws his left Crumphau, or at least his right to left Crumphau, and he's almost able to block it, but is unable to. And now, in my opinion, this isn't the fault of the Crumphau, but just the fault of this very particular exchange where Arto just didn't quite have his hands far enough forward. And one of the things that you want to make sure of if you're going to copy this style of parrying is that when you throw your Crumphaus, the two aspects that you want to make sure of is A, that your crossguard and your blade are always pointed in the direction of your opponent's sword. And that's somewhat easy to do when you're throwing a big windshield wiper technique, because the only time you're going to stop is when you hit somebody else's sword. So that part's pretty easy. But what you also have to make sure is that your hands are far enough forward and that you are presenting your body behind your arms and behind your guard. The reason for this is, as demonstrated here, if you keep them too close to your body or too close off to one side, you are not adequately protecting your torso or your neck. And what you are instead doing is leaving an opening here where your crossbar here is going to prevent everything that comes past this point, but not anything that lands right outside of it. So if you want to copy Arto's Crumphau's, what you really need to do is these big windshield wiper motions. They can be very effective, especially when paired with passing steps. They can be very good at setting aside thrusts and cuts. You just need to make sure that you stay behind it. And again, one of the ways that you can easily stay behind it is that if you move offline, if you take a big step to your right at about a 30-degree angle, and then you throw a big left Crumphau with your arms extended, chances are your torso is going to be behind the line of your crossguard. And you will be because you moved offline and not be straight forward. A simple application, but one in which we saw it just not quite work out. So for our next exchange, we have another classic aspect of Arto fencing, and that is the thrust. And if you have watched this channel before and you know anything about thrusting, you know that sparring is one of the best things to throw after a missed thrust. So we're starting to get into the point here where we're really describing all of Arto's loop. He can throw a sparring or a thrust from cold open, go off of a parry riposte, and these all kind of throw together along with the Crumphau and the passing steps. But in this particular aspect, we just see the thrust work on its own. And one of the interesting aspects of Arto's thrusting is that it's actually very, very simple. One thing you see a lot in the meta of HEMA today is that people just don't throw thrusts from cold open much anymore. They tend to flick them in like it's a shield how, or duck them under like it's a contravvazione from, rapier fencing, or they do it with a really deep lunge. And it's very unusual to just see somebody put their point on line, take that big step forward, and just drive it into your face. And one of the reasons that I think this works so effectively is that it has very little in the way of tells. It's very difficult to tell whether or not someone is going to do something or pull out of their thrust when you do it in this particular way, as opposed to doing it like a big flicking shield howl where you know they're going to throw either a cut or a thrust, and you can more or less do the same parry regardless. As you can see here, Trevor obviously thought that Arto was basically just taking a step forward and was probably going to parry, and tried to throw a little bit of a counter shield howl of his own, which did actually land, but mostly got pushed out of the way by this big thrust. Now, it is technically a double, and it is worth pointing out that it is a double, because one of the flaws of just throwing a thrust from cold open is that you're going to double sometimes. But I think one of the principles of Arto's style here is that he almost always goes for deep targets, and deep targets almost exclusively. So in a way, this idea of throwing a thrust from cold open can be a really good tool for dealing with people who just love to throw hand snipes and try to run away. That being as simple where you're just going straight forward, driving a thrust forward, not doing anything fancy, not moving your blade even an inch in a different direction. And as a result, you're going to take the best advantage of your big passing step, and you're going to be pretty good at chasing people down who, again, are trying to theoretically hit you in the hand and run away. Of course, that's not what happened here, but it is worth pointing out that one of the reasons that this can work so well is that it's almost a understood method of throwing a thrust that either someone is going to have to parry it pretty hard or double, or that they're just going to get stabbed. So going back to Trevor for a minute, one of the reasons that Trevor is so effective as a fencer is that he pairs very short, very fast, and very precise techniques with very short, precise, and accurate footwork. And the reason these pair so well together is because, as you can see by this exchange, it's really hard to get a read on what he's doing at any given time. And he does this through two distinct ways. One, with the footwork, as you can see throughout this exchange and pretty much all the others, he's constantly bouncing up on his toes and bouncing a little bit forward and backward each time. The idea here is that he's desensitizing you visually to his movements to the point where you can't really easily tell whether he's moving forward or backward, whether he's attacking or defending, and as a result, he's putting you in a kind of analysis paralysis where you're just going to sit there and think, oh, well, he's not doing anything, only to find out that he has done something, or you think he's doing something and you overreact, only to find that you've created a new opening for him to seize. What happens here is the former, where he goes in with a little bit of a simple hop, taps Arto's blade, sees that he's going to stay defensive, does another little simple hop, taps him on the head, and then hops out, all before Arto has really even registered what happened to him. And the reason is because Arto wanted to make sure that he didn't overreact by feeling that contact on his blade and then just throwing one of his big Crumphaus. If he had, chances are Trevor would have been able to pull his blade out of measure and hit him in the new opening that Arto had just created, and Arto clearly knew that. But in that same measure, he started to overly desensitize himself. And as a result, he didn't throw anything, whether a parry or a response, because he relied a little bit too much on his cron-based position. Now, one of the things that you'll notice when you watch Arto fence is he loves to stand in this kind of unwound plow that's maybe a little bit higher than most people would put it. And he puts it there very much on purpose. One, because it makes it very good for winding out of and throwing a stab, but also because he can kind of just turn his hands like this and go to either side in order to protect most of these openings. The problem is that the technique that Trevor threw was a Scheitelhaus straight down the top, kind of to the head and a little bit to the neck. And it was very short and it didn't have a lot of pullback. Now, I'm not going to say that this shot wouldn't do any damage. It absolutely would. And as you know, I'm not really interested in what does damage. What's more important, though, is the idea here that Arto clearly looks for big wind-ups on a lot of the techniques that he waits for. And as a result, he can utilize that to know where it's coming from and then throw his appropriate defense. So because Trevor doesn't do anything in that particular way, there wasn't a lot of information to go off of, and he ended up just kind of standing there. So that's going to be it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed watching two really high-level fencers spar together. Hopefully you learned something about how each of them fences and how you could maybe try to do it yourself. But I think most importantly, what we also want to remember, and again with the overarching meta-analysis here being that when you go to somebody's seminar, whether it be Arto or Trevor or anybody else, you have to be able to learn both from the fact that you might get the crap kicked out of you by someone who's way better than you, but also learn from the fact that you beat the crap out of somebody else. You have to be able to learn from somebody who just fences differently than you, regardless of whether or not it's working against you or not, or whether it's working against somebody that you think is really good or not. I think that Arto and Trevor are both really high-level fencers, and regardless of which would win in a tournament, is not really the conversation to be having when you're at a seminar. What you're trying to learn here is what you can copy and what you can discard and what you can adapt from each of their actions when they're fighting each other so that you can be the one who benefits the most from watching something like this. So if you want to see more stuff like this, I will be coming out with more videos next week, and I'll see you next time.